Piers Morgan's Nick Fuentes interview was crazy. I'm not even young, but it seemed like he was messing with Piers the whole time, not really taking any of it seriously. You seem to understand him, meaning Nick, though. Could you weigh in? All right. So I was asked on Wednesday, I think it was, to go on Piers Morgan as part of a panel to talk about Nick Fuentes' interview with Piers Morgan. And honestly, I talked about this before. I have a pretty much absolute policy against doing panel discussions. If you ever see me like on a show or on Fox, I'm always by myself. I will not be part of a panel. I'll debate somebody one-on-one. That's great. I love that. But I will not be part of like a panel where you have like 5 people and like bickering for air. That I'm not doing. It's degrading. It's pointless. People end up screaming over each other. You're throwing poop at each other for the pleasure of the entertainment of the audience. I'm not interested. And so I get asked to do a lot of panels, including that show. And I say no. I've been on that show before. One time I went on because I got to debate Dan Crenshaw on Ukraine. So there are a couple times I'll go on and say yes if there's like if it's a small panel, not even really a panel, but a one-on-one with somebody I want to debate or a topic I want to debate. But generally I say no. This time I said yes because I do believe that I had things to say about Nick Fuentes and how he's understood, or more accurately misunderstood, by the kind of Piers Morgan sector of the media. And I wanted to be able to make these points. And although it was a panel of 5 people, I never had to fight to be heard. Sometimes they were talking about things that bored me so much, and I was just play on my phone until then Piers would come to me and say, I want to bring Glenn Greenwald, and let me ask you this. And then I just said what I had to say. So I'm going to show you a couple clips of this. If you want to watch the whole thing, you can watch the whole thing. I think I only talked 3 or 4 times, but I also feel like I made the most of it. I was very satisfied. I got to say most of what I wanted to say. So I'm just going to go over a couple of these clips. Here's the first clip where I was on with Mark Lamont Hill, who I've known for a long time. He's very much like a leftist, but who thinks everybody on the right is racist and fascist or whatever. I don't want to speak for Mark. He's not an uninteresting person, but I'm just summarizing how I see him. And then Harry Sisson, who just, I can't think of anything sadder than being 21 or 22. And like, I think it's great to be politically active, but like to be politically active, like in defense of the establishment, devote yourself to the Democratic Party and like Joe Biden. You know, I don't want to judge him too much. He's 21. I'm sure I'll have a long trajectory, but he was there. And then some social conservative, Andrew something, and then some other guy who I actually found very interesting. I was not familiar with him. I think his name is Harrison something. He was very like low key, like almost like so low key that he like could have been like on the verge of sleeping or high, but he was saying very, very like interesting, insightful things. And the first part of the interview was Mark Lamont Hill basically saying he thinks it's a very difficult thing to decide to platform Nick Fuentes. He wasn't saying you shouldn't, but he was saying even in general, if you believe that you should interview all people, probably Nick Fuentes, you can make a strong argument as somebody that you shouldn't ever platform because you're just helping him. And no matter how much you think you're exposing him or whatever. I think one of the most interesting things is every generation starts to have their kind of entertainment and news and media and culture they consume. And every single time that happens, people in prior generations don't understand it, think it's toxic and destructive and dangerous, and freak out about it. My parents were born in the 1940s, so they grew up in the 50s and 60s, and my mother and father loved Elvis Presley, especially my mother. She was in love with Elvis Presley. And Elvis Presley was, the first kind of white entertainer to like use this grinding rock stuff. And the people of the prior generation thought this was going to ruin American youth. They didn't even understand it. And then like, how is this even music? This is screaming. They wanted Frank Sinatra. And this repeats itself all the time. So I go out of my way to make sure I pay attention to Gen Z. especially political content like streaming, the streaming world. Because if you don't, you're just going to look at things and be confused by what millions of people who just happen to be younger than you are thinking and consuming. And you're just being like, I don't understand this at all. This looks terrible to me. And trying to understand it, I think, is extremely important. So I think a lot of the reaction to Nick Fuentes, especially by the kind of Piers Morgans, kind of very mainstream media part of the media ecosystem, is a big part of this. And I think some of this did come out in our exchange. So let's look at the first clip, which was when I was asked whether or not someone should platform Nick Fuentes.
I'm not saying we should interview controversial people. I'm just saying this particular guy, I feel like we're playing into his interests and his angle.
Yeah, well, Glenn Greenwald, welcome back to Uncensored. You've had Fuentes on your show. What's your view about that issue, about platforming him at all?
Oh, I didn't even consider it to be a difficult question at all. I mean, if you're going to have people on who are responsible for the invasion and destruction of Iraq based on lies, or the incineration of Vietnam, or the destruction of Gaza and the deaths of tens of thousands of people, and welcome them and treat them like respectable people, tell me what it is that Nick Fuentes has done remotely as bad as that justifies allowing them to come on and speak, but not him. And whether you like it or not, he does speak for a huge number of people in his generation and even other generations as well, who feel the same kind of anger and frustration with the status quo, with the establishment, with the kind of dogma that we've been told we have to accept. And there's a lot of people who are angry about it and who rebel against it. And we saw this with Donald Trump on maybe a little bit of a smaller scale, but very much the same pattern. When Donald Trump appeared, everybody was like, oh, he's racist and fascist and he's the misogynist and he's this and that. And no one wanted to grapple with the reason why his message was resonating so much. And to me, it is very similar to Nick Fuentes. Say what you want about him. He's extremely smart, an incredibly talented communicator, and very well read. Like, he's very informed. He's not just some sensationalist babbling on the internet. And I think the reason he has attracted a lot of attention is because he's speaking to the anger and frustration, a lot of which is valid, of a lot of people. And to stick your head in the sand and say, oh, we're going to pretend that this isn't happening because his views are too off, but the people who start wars or are responsible for the 2008 financial crisis, these are respectable people who we treat with respect, like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or whoever. That, to me, is the kind of thing that I think is really distorted.
Yeah, you know, Warren Smith. I'll
respond to that.
Well, no, let me bring in Warren Smith first, and then I'll come back to you, Mark.
Warren Smith is who I was referring to. Actually, he was the person in the upper center. It's really like the Brady Bunch format. We were just missing like Bobby Brady and Cindy Brady, and I think Carol Brady, who was at the bottom. But in any event, he was the one I was saying was actually an interesting, nuanced thinker. But in any event, this drives me crazy well beyond the Nick Fuentes question. This whole idea that, oh, so-and-so believes in this conspiracy theory and so-and-so spread this false story. Why should they have any credibility? And it's like, you look at what the New York Times did in selling the Iraq war to the American people based on lies, or propagating the Russiagate hoax for years and giving themselves Pulitzers for it, or calling any questioning of the COVID origin theory that it came from a wet market and might have come instead from a lab, calling it racist and saying that it shouldn't even be heard. Nobody spreads fake news and disinformation that has been more destructive than mainstream media outlets. And if they want to turn around and say these people should be disqualified to be heard because they believe in this conspiracy or once said this, it's like, what you've done, even though you're the respectable media, nobody would ever say you should be excluded. What you've done is so much worse in every regard. And this is how I consider the reaction to Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is a podcaster. Nick Fuentes never started any wars. He's not responsible for anyone's death. He didn't destroy the financial security of not just Americans, but billions of people around the world. The repercussions of that continue to this day. Through turning the stock market into a casino with no guardrails because they knew they were too big to fail and the government would bail them out, which they did. Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Lindsey Graham and all of them have massive amounts of blood in their hands. And every day, Piers Morgan would interview them every day. Like, ooh, Secretary Clinton, great to see you. I'm not picking here on Piers. It's true for every one of these shows. Like Face the Nation and Meet the Press. And these are people who have lied their ways into war. They interview Netanyahu, who international courts and Israeli genocide scholars say is committed a genocide. But Nick Fuentes is a bridge too far. His views are too toxic, or he's too toxic to even allow to be heard. But all these monsters and criminals, war criminals and common criminals, they're fine. And they're not just fine, but you put them on the air all the time and you treat them like respectable statesmen. No, this is something I vehemently reject. That's been driving me crazy for a long time. All right, so speaking of that, seeing that I was kind of defending Nick Fuentes' participation in the discourse, and they knew ahead of time that I was going to do that. They had seen me talking this way and asked me to kind of give some very basic thoughts about my views, and I made clear that these were a little bit were them. So this didn't come as a surprise to them. They put me on knowing this. But Piers asked me about what he thought was the worst of the Nick Fuentes comments, where he basically refused to shed tears about the Holocaust, seemed to make light of the Holocaust. In the past has called into question the authenticity of the 6 million people who died, and basically wanted to say, okay, but isn't this so morally beyond the pale? And this was that exchange.
Views off of.
Well, the other thing, if I could jump in, the other thing we bring.
Come on, man, don't crash out like you did on that podcast, man.
Hang on, let me bring Glenn back in. The other argument, which I thought was interesting, and I thought I missed a bit of a trick here with him, was when he was talking about the Holocaust, where people have assumed he's a Holocaust denier because of things he said in the past, of trivializing it and questioning the number of people who've died and so on. He seemed to try and take a more moderate position, which was, yes, I believe 6 million Jews were killed, maybe more. Whether he meant that or whether he was being some sort of satirical.
He was satirizing you. He was satirizing that.
That's what I now believe was probably happening. Yeah. So I suspect he was.
Yeah.
But regardless, his argument was it all happened so long ago. Why did Jews continue talking about the Holocaust? We've all moved on. They use it all the time as a political weapon and so on. And of course, I suppose the obvious question for him, I went and checked afterwards how many times he's talked about, for example, on his show, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which was over 2,000 years ago, right? He does it all the time. So, if I'd been smart in the moment as a fellow Christian, I would say, well, hang on, but isn't that exactly what Christians do all the time about the crucifixion? What's the difference?
Sounds like his religion does matter to him.
Because it's absolutely central to their religion. And I think, I do think so much of what your interview with Nick Fuentes highlighted was extreme generational differences. It was sometimes like watching two people speak different languages. Piers, you and I are kind of the same age. You're obviously older. Everyone can see that, but just a little bit. And, for people who were born in the 60s, the Holocaust was just 20 years before. World War II had just ended 20 years before. There was a mythology about the United States, about our role in the world, about how great of a country we were, about all the great things we did, about the Holocaust, the unique evil. Now it's 75 years ago. And people who are a next generation, where Harrys were born in, 2000 and 2002. And this idea that the Holocaust has been weaponized. We've been beaten over the head with it for 8 decades. We've been forced to spend and pay huge amounts of money in reparations, or that slavery is sometimes weaponized that way. This is a very common view. So I think when he's doing things like making jokes about the Holocaust, it's not because he thinks it's funny that huge numbers of people were exterminated. I think it's a way of purposely being transgressive about orthodoxies and pieties that a lot of people in his generation don't accept. But Glenn,
hang on. There was a callousness to it. And I'll tell you why. I brought on a guy called Danny Finkelstein. He's a top journalist for the Times newspaper over here, who wrote a very powerful book about his family and their horrendous experience at the hands of Hitler and Stalin. And it's incredibly powerful. It's very moving. It's informed his life. And I'm going to talk to Danny, actually, after we finish this, because he's been on the receiving end of the most appalling abuse in the last 48 hours, all directed by Nick Fuentes, who was so dismissive of him talking about his mother and father, so just callous in the way he responded. It's that kind of utter devoidness of any empathy whatsoever. You can have a view that we should try and move on generationally from these seismic moments, okay, but you don't have to be so callous towards somebody whose family literally got murdered by people like Hitler and Stalin, do we? I mean...
But the idea, Pierre, I think the thing is like this generation of people grew up in the wake of the Iraq War, in the wake of endless war, in the wake of the destruction of their financial security with the 2008 financial crisis, with all the lies of COVID and Russiagate and all the rest of it. And faith and trust in these institutions have collapsed. So when they look at people who represent institutional thinking and they're told you're not allowed to make fun of this and you're not allowed to talk about this and except in the ways that we prescribe, and we're going to call you all these names unless you affirm all these pieties over and over and over again. One of the ways of rebelling against that is to say, you know, and it's a very common generational reaction is to say, F you, we're going to transgress every line that you told us we can't because we hate you. We think that the things that you're doing have been destructive to our lives. And I think like ignoring that part of youthful transgression, which is very common.
You know what, Glenn? I think it's a very valid point, and there may well be a generational thing to this. Let me bring in Warren, just for the record, by the way, Andrew.
You know, it's really bizarre. I think a lot of people forget what they did and how they thought when they were younger. I'll tell you this just quick experience that I had that's very relevant to that exchange, which was when my kids became teenagers, they started engaging in teenage behavior, like just, you know, rebellion for its own sake. And they were consuming one of the things they would do, just like that I couldn't stand, was I didn't mind that they played video games, but they would watch people playing video games. Like they weren't playing video games. They were like watching someone on YouTube playing video games. That's like how a lot of these streamers who decided to become political, like Destiny and those kind of people, that's how they started. They like would play video games online and people would watch them play video games. And my kids would do that. I'd be like, I would be beside myself. I would go into their room and I'd be, how can you do this? Why are you watching other people playing video games? Like, play video games if you want, but don't watch people playing video games. And they would look at me like I was crazy. Like, these shows are so popular. And I couldn't understand it. And then sometimes they would say things, or, you know, I would tell them to do something and they wouldn't do it, like standard teenage rebellion. And I would call my mother or my father and I would say, oh my God, my kids are doing this and my kids are doing that. My mother especially, she would like always say, are you joking? Do you know you did all of that and so much worse? And she always say like, I'm so glad that I'm alive to like witness you're having to deal with that with your kids, given what you put me through. Like, and I would think about it. I would like, God, that's so true. I did do that as a teenager. Like these behaviors that my kids are doing as teenagers, and I'm like, I can't. This is mystifying. I can't comprehend it. Why are like those are things I did too, and worse. And I have always said that one of the things for which I'm most grateful, and I mean this, is that there was no internet when I was 18 or 20 or 22, or even when there was internet when I was 25. Like it still was so anonymous. I'm so happy that every thought that I had, every transgressive, you know, act of mine where you're testing limits and surpassing them and you're angry at the older generation's establishment way of being and you want to find your own way. And, you know, it's like the 1960s was all about that. F the establishment. In 1992, Sinead O'Connor went on SNL and ripped up a picture of the Pope. It's like so unnecessary, but she was trying to express anger at the Catholic Church. And she was young and the young people loved it. And then, you know, years later, she came adult and she kind of regretted it. And this is so common. It's like when you're young, and I do think, especially when the system has failed you, and I do think our system has failed an entire generation of young men. And you could say young white men in particular, like in a specific way. And you know, there's, whether you agree with it or not, there is a perception among that group, a lot of them, that is true. And that's what Nick Fuentes is speaking for in a lot of ways. Yes, like the Holocaust doesn't matter to them. Why would it? It's ancient history. You know, I had this experience like when I started writing about journalism. What shaped my views were like 9/11, the reaction to it, the Patriot Act, the Iraq War, the lies of anthrax. And, you know, you say that to some 23-year-old and they're going to look at you like you're, well, Like a lot of people that age don't have any idea what the Snowden reporting was from 10 years ago, and it seems like ancient history. And so the Holocaust, it's not just that Jews talk about it a lot, it's been weaponized continuously to say, this is why you have to give money to Israel. This is why you have to venerate Israel. This is why you have to give reparations to Israel. This is why you have to constantly think about Israel. This is why you go to the Wailing Wall and you visit Israel and you honor Israel because of the Holocaust. And so it's like this sacred secular religion. And if you're angry in general about establishment thinking, and if you're in particular angry about how Israel plays such a central role, occupies such a central place in our politics, you're angry that you have to keep giving your money to Israel, that yes, like mocking the Holocaust is going to be something that people are going to do, not because they like the idea of millions of people being marched into their deaths. It's not like it's a positive thing. It's transgression. It's a way of sticking your middle finger up at the people that you believe, often validly, are responsible for the problems of your life. And then on top of that, you add to that the fact that these people have constantly been told that they're not allowed to say what they think, and if they do, they're going to be labeled racist and anti-Semites and misogynists or whatever. And at some point, they stop caring about that. They don't care anymore. And like for Piers Morgan, I get it. Like his whole life, like the Holocaust, that is the most sacred secular event there is. But for people in a generation, 50 years later, that's not the case. And so they're speaking different languages. And it's easy to look at it and say, oh, they're mocking the Holocaust because they hate Jews and want to but I just don't think that's the language. It's like you have to pay attention to what people are talking about. You don't have to. You can ignore young culture, but then don't comment on it. Like don't convince yourself that you understand it, that you're able to interpret what it is. But if you're going to comment on it, like understand where it's coming from, understand what the factors are that have led to the anger that is being expressed, led to the desire to ignore these rules of discourse. Like at the end of the day, making a joke about something like like any historical evil doesn't mean that you're actually perpetrating it. And I think that's how people see the Holocaust. Like, and there was one point in the interview where Piers Morgan was like, how can you possibly make a joke about the Holocaust? And Nick Fuentes looked at him and he was like, what, too soon? And Piers Morgan was born 20 years after the Holocaust. Nick Fuentes was born, 50 years after the Holocaust, or 40 years after the Holocaust, 50 years after the Holocaust or more. And now we're 80 years after the Holocaust. And so that is the difference in perspective. And I think there's so much of that. And it does remind me so much of Trump. I'm not personalizing this about Piers Morgan. I don't dislike Piers Morgan. I like some of what he does actually. But, Piers Morgan he has a very successful career. The mainstream media treated him very well. The Western establishment rewarded him, has a very nice life, is very wealthy. He's famous. He hangs out with a lot of celebrities, goes on yachts, goes on boats. He doesn't have the anger that you would have if you're 24 and you feel like you're one of the people who's been tossed aside and devalued, that can't get a decent job, that has to work 3 jobs to earn a living, that can't start a family, that can't get a girlfriend, that can't get married, that can't buy a house, that live with their parents. Like these perspectives, these come from a completely different universe. And of course, the way of communicating, the way of thinking about things is going to be fundamentally different. And if you're not working to understand where that other sector is coming from and what's influencing their thought, like I said, it's like speaking 2 different languages. All right, let's look at this last part here, which was Piers Morgan was talking about how he had been inundated with all kinds of obscene and bigoted messages from the Groypers, which are Nick Fuentes' followers, in the days following the interview. And I have no doubt that was true. I'm sure that was true. I mean, one time I had like a very innocuous exchange with Nick Fuentes. It was like years ago. He had said something like, if Glenn Greenwald's really gay, why does he dress so poorly? I forget where he said it. It was like in some forum. but it made its way to Twitter and I saw it. And I basically said something like, God, this is the gayest and bitchiest comment I ever heard. Something like that. And I was inundated with Groyper anger for like 3 days, every single conceivable insult. And there were a lot of them. But, I've been at war with pretty much every political faction in the United States and Brazil and Europe at one point or another. This is maybe the Groypers are a little more intense. Maybe. I'm not so sure. Maybe they're a little bit more vicious. I'm not so sure. This doesn't bother me at all. This seems very commonplace for the internet. But this was the exchange we had about the Groypers and about Piers Morgan feeling like he had been swarmed by their rage.
And extraordinarily widespread. They just come as this mob, and it's if you're not me, who's got a very thick skin, it's a pretty hard thing to get back at you. Look, I don't care. I've had a lot worse, and they'll move on, and that's what happens. But if you're not, actually, it can be very intimidating. It was very threatening. Very racist, very anti-Semitic, very, very nasty, actually. Like I said, it wasn't scrape the surface with me because I got a skin of 1,000 rhinos. But to other people, I could see it really being a pretty terrifying experience.
Hey, Piers, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Sorry. They're doing that. They're doing that too.
Sorry, Glenn go first, yeah.
Let me answer the question. It's really
hang on, guys. Don't talk at once. Let me start with Glenn.
Thanks. Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt. But the issue is, why does he have such a loyal following? Why does he have such a large and loyal following? Now, you can ask that question about Donald Trump, and a lot of people are satisfied by saying, oh, America's just filled with racists and misogynists and xenophobes, and he's playing into that. And maybe that is part of it. Politicians do demagogue and play to our worst instincts always, but there was a lot more to it than that. And I think people understand 10 years later that there is and was a lot more to that. So you can say, oh, yeah, Nick Fuentes has this army of angry young men who are incredibly devoted to him, who believe that he's speaking truth uniquely, because they're also a bunch of Nazis and racists and Jew haters. And okay, that's an easy. I think there's a lot more to it, and I think people ought to grapple with the reason why he's speaking for so many people.
I think that's a very valid point. I've always said about Andrew Tate, for example, that a lot of the things he says, I can understand. If you're a young, slightly disenfranchised young man, you feel society has got it in for you, and all you ever hear is man bashing. I can understand why you gravitate to a guy like Tate, who stands there tall and proud as a very masculine kind of guy, beating his chest, talking about taking care of your body and getting fit and being a protector and all these things. I get all that.
And then he went on to say, but then he veers into misogyny, and that's when he gets off the train. But these lines, you can go up to here and you can't pass it. And if you do, you're going to stand accused of being a misogynist. You can, when you're talking about Israel, you can go up to this line, but over that line are prohibited ideas. You can't make fun of the Holocaust. You can't question these sacred orthodoxies. If you do, you're going to stand accused of being an anti-Semite. You can talk about immigration, but if you go over this line, you're going to be accused of being. People are sick of those lines. And the main reason they're sick of those lines is because they're being imposed by people they think have no credibility any longer to impose rules and lines. Because these people and their ideology and their way of thinking has proven to be utterly destructive, especially to the lives of the people transgressing those rules. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.